Hello, everybody. Here I am live from Florence, which is a joy because I've been in Pontesorvio up until now, my hometown. So live from Florence, and joining us this evening for TF Together is Allison Levy. Allison, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where you are right now as well.
Okay, thanks, Helen. And so I am live from Providence, Rhode Island. I work at Brown University. I'm an art historian. I work in publishing now at Brown, so not teaching the Renaissance, but working with our humanities faculty on an initiative to introduce digital publishing to the humanities. And so that keeps me very busy. It's very innovative, exciting work. But that said, I still have one foot very firmly planted in print publishing. I, of course, just produced a printed volume that we're going to talk about today. And I also serve as a series editor for Amsterdam University Press. In fact, you can see the books from the series behind me. So,
oh, they're wonderful, Alison. I do love a good book background when we do these.
I know. So these are all sort of book series here, and a section on Alberti and Palazzo Rucellai, and then some other subject matter that is really, important to me. So I move between the digital and the print in the publishing world. But I love Florence. I am a former resident of Florence and a big fan of the Florentine. So I am really happy to be here today.
I mean, this is the whole point about what we do. It's the idea of Florence lovers all over the world. There's people who live here, people who are connected to Florence, people who are in love with Florence.
Yeah.
And I mean, we know one another because of your book, House of Secrets, The Many Lives of the Florentine Palazzo. I mean, you fell in love, you're very open about this, with a palazzo, Palazzo Rucellai, when you were 18. That's correct, right? When you were 18. Right. And maybe tell us about what it is that made you fall in love with that particular palazzo in Florence.
Well, yes, it has been a long love story, that's for sure, with ups and downs and a breakup along the way. But now I can speak very nostalgically about it. Well, yeah, so my first encounter with this building was in a dark college classroom at Tulane University. I enrolled thinking that I would go into medicine, and of course that was short-lived, and I took an art survey course, and the professor, his specialty was the Italian Renaissance. So of course the focus was heavily on the 15th and 16th century in Italy. And so sitting in this darkened classroom, looking at these slides that were still, projected onto the flat screen, old-fashioned art history, which we no longer teach it that way today. But this building popped up, and it just struck me. Everything about Florence, I have to say, the paintings, the architecture, the sculpture, especially Donatello's Bronze David, another very early love that I was introduced to also in that semester. I had traveled to Florence when I was in high school as part of the sort of European Grand Tour in 1985, and Florence was the highlight. I didn't expect it to be, but you know how these things happen. But I didn't think that I would study art history. But then that did change, and I did. And then I took a seminar on Alberti, which was offered the next semester. So I really took a big leap there from the art survey into that seminar. And that's when I really came to know Palazzo Rucellai. The focus, of course, was on his architecture and his book, the 10 books on architecture, which is here. This is
pull them out, Allison. Let us see the books.
This is my undergraduate copy, and marked up. I don't know what at the time I was highlighting, but so it stayed with me. And then I went to graduate school, but my focus there wasn't Alberti, and it wasn't architecture. I worked on portraits and widows. So that was my earliest specialty as a grad student, as an early career scholar. And I wrote several books on widowhood, on masculinity, on memory, on the visual and material culture of sexuality. So I was all about the human body, you might say, and not architecture at all. I was very interested in ritual and spaces and how life played out in the Renaissance. And of course, buildings were part of that. But in my mind, they were sort of backdrop. And then I went to Florence in, I believe it was 2005, 2006, on a sabbatical. And I was going there to write a book on tomb sculpture, not a light topic, but something that fascinated me nonetheless. And so I had a year off. This was right after Hurricane Katrina. I wasn't living in New Orleans at the time, but my family was there. And so it had been a difficult year. And I was in need of just some escapism, if you will. I think we all feel that right now a little bit.
Oh, yes.
So there I was going back to Florence. And of course, I'd gone every summer. I always walked by Palazzo Rucellai. I always sat on the built-in bench on the facade. It was always my favorite building in Florence. I knew enough about it to know that the family still owned it, that it was a private home. And so I didn't let my imagination run wild, because it seemed like a very private thing for me to admire at a remove. And I took great joy in doing so. That's about as far as the story went. And then, so here I was in Providence, because I was teaching at Wheaton College in Massachusetts at the time. Looking on the internet, because I just wanted a great little apartment for the year. Who doesn't?
I mean, it's that thing in Florence. It's that eternal hunt. Actually, right now, Allison, you can take your pick. However, back then, I understand.
Exactly. And, the descriptions were so misleading. Charming probably meant teeny tiny. And, sunny meant sweltering. So, you have to read between the lines still today, I'm sure. So there I am looking for something, and I stumble upon an apartment located in the famous Palazzo Rucellai. And I thought, well, surely this
meant
is
to be.
And so I called the agency the next morning, and sure enough, yes, this was a room in Palazzo Rucellai. I was told that the family does rent out some of the spaces. I'd have to pay my rent up front for the year. And that was a stretch, but I had a stipend for this sabbatical. So I poured everything into the rent, and I moved into Palazzo Rucellai. So I thought, going over to Florence on that trip, with just 2 big suitcases, I thought I was going for 9 months to work on tomb sculpture, shipped all of those notes to Florence. I mean, ridiculous when I think of it now, but that's what we do when we go off on sabbatical. And I arrived, and I was handed the key to the front door of Palazzo Rucellai. And,
wow.
Who
was it like one of those ancient, it felt like it had history to tell you, that particular key? Was it
right? I mean, this key, the key to the front door of Palazzo Rucellai. How many people have passed through that front door who were not family members, and not just in the current generation, but for 550 years. I'm sure the key has changed, but probably not that much. And so, right. So I moved in just thinking, well, this is going to be the highlight of my year, if not my life, living in Palazzo Rucellai. And then, so there too, that's sort of all I expected, just like the fabulousness of living in Palazzo Rucellai. But then as soon as I got in there, I realized I know nothing about this building. It is a strange space, beautiful space, but the layers of history immediately became just so palpable to me. I mean, I was very much, and my apartment was between stories. And in fact, that was the working title for the book for some time, Between Stories. So a mezzanine floor had been added in the 18th century. So, and so I was living in this little room that had been a servant's room or a storage room, with the windows had been bricked in, so there was no view out onto Via della Vigna Nuova. And I was literally floating in between the top two floors of this house. So that was peculiar.
Disorientating. Must have been very disorientating.
And just so, yes, a very strange feeling. There was a early 20th century birdcage elevator, gorgeous relic that brought me up directly into the apartment. But of course, it had not been serviced since it was installed, most likely. So I was always getting stuck in this elevator. So living between floors, getting stuck literally in Palazzo Rucellai in its many layers, was very disconcerting, but fascinating. And I was really pulled into this vortex, and I voluntarily let myself go completely. And so it was, my daily activity was letting myself get lost in Palazzo Rucellai, and that entertained me for some time. And then I really then wanted to understand where exactly, in terms of the architecture, the physical space, where was I, and how had Giovanni Rucellai assembled all of these properties? I knew, there's that famous quote from his notebook. He wrote, "From 8 houses, I made 1."
Yeah.
So, and then Alberti's facade, which was the only thing I knew when I arrived in this story, is this perfect, elegant, symmetrical, logical facade. That's what I was expecting on the inside, and it's the complete opposite. So I wanted to better understand that tension between the facade, the public face of Palazzo Rucellai, and where I was living. So then it was going to the Kunst and going to I Tatti and going to the Biblioteca Nazionale and not doing a piece of work on the Tomb Project, but devoting all of my library time to looking at, reading about Palazzo Rucellai on a different level, at that advanced level, pouring through the research, things that I had not done as an undergraduate when I took that seminar. And I realized that my apartment then, which was the name of the apartment, is Archivio.
Archivio, yeah. It's a nice name. It's a very intellectual
I know.
space. Yeah.
Who could have invented this? So Archivio, I mentioned that it exists between layers, it's floating. I realized that it floats above the original cornerstone of Palazzo Rucellai. On that site was the very modest medieval townhouse that Giovanni Rucellai inherited from his father. And to me, that's the root of his palace complex, physically and psychologically. And so something really interesting started coming together in my mind. I was starting to tell my own story about this house. And at the same time, as I was thinking very much as an academic, as an art historian, I also had friends in Florence, Florentine friends. And, to me, it was so exciting to be able to say, I'm living in Palazzo Rucellai this year. And they were some of them were horrified by that fact. They said, why would you want to live there? And I thought, I was sort of floored. Well, why wouldn't I? And, and I'm thinking again, still this house as Alberti's facade, Giovanni Rucellai's house, thinking of it as a Renaissance object. They were thinking of it as something that that they're living with now, right? And so then I started to hear stories about the house that you don't find in the library, and one being, of course, the horrific murder that took place in the house in 1997. And that's when I realized, well, there is really a different way to think and talk and write about this house, and I really want to look at not look at the house so much as a Renaissance object, but look at the afterlife or afterlives of this house. And so I just really threw myself into that project. That's when I realized there was a book project here.
I mean, that's what's so fascinating. It's a riveting read, Allison, and I've read it a couple of times quite happily, and happily I actually just loaned it to a friend the other day, this book, and I was like, no, I need it back because I'm speaking to Allison on Friday. But I mean, what's so fascinating about this book is, because you're an art historian, but this is not a book written, it's not an art history book. This is scholarship meets personal story, meets gossip, meets intrigue, a bit of murder, a suicide bride, a lodger built for a wedding. There really is, it's a very contemporary read, as well as a read, you know, a gallop through the history.
Yeah,
I mean, and that's fascinating. There's a sentence that I particularly like that you said, that it's Palazzo Rucellai is a stage on which to perform or a screen behind which to hide. Mm. And I think that's fascinating, especially right now. Mm. It makes me think about architecture, you know, and our places, our spaces in the current situation. You know, our homes are places where, you know, we often hide away from the world, but right now, you know, due to the circumstances, we're obliged to sort of perform as well, you know, for moments like this.
Yeah.
So I mean, and maybe expand a little bit on the what emerged in terms of the gossip and the characters, because that's another part of the book that I absolutely love, are these characters, you know. Maybe tell us a little bit about some of the characters and how you crafted them.
Yeah, well, so you're right. This is not a traditional art history book. I chose not to do that. So I wanted to tell not another architectural history. All that exists. It's behind me. It's been done quite well. I wanted to tell a character-driven story of the house. So I wanted to explore and bring to readers these fascinating lives that have played out under the roof of Palazzo Rucellai over 550 years. And there are some very colorful characters, some very toxic characters as well. And I wanted the full range. I didn't want to tell a romantic story about this house, or by extension, Florence. That too has been done very well. And to me, the lives were just so interesting, particularly the way that the house shaped those lives. So yes, I see it as the stage for the performance of lives. I also see it as the screen behind which to hide. And I referenced the palace complex of Giovanni Rucellai. Every character in this book has a palace complex, as I see it. So that was sort of how I decided who goes in and who stays out, and myself included. So it may not yet be clear to the readers, the audience today, that my life too is a story. So to me, that was one of the most important experiences of that sabbatical was the residency in the house. That's what got me to the story. So I felt that it was necessary that I be in that story, that I be a character too. And so in alternating chapters, you have sort of a neat 12-month timeline. I indeed, in fact, lived in the house for 3.5 years, but because I ended up staying, giving something away there. But yeah, so in alternating chapters, you get the story of my residency and what unfolds, how I'm doing the research. So there's a meta-narrative that's worked in there. But it's also the story of me sort of grappling with this house, you know, following in the footsteps of all of these other characters, presenting them, but then also seeing maybe remnants of their behavior or activities trickling into mine. And I did intentionally let all of that bleed together. When I say I let myself go in Palazzo Rucellai, I very much did. It was absolutely a year of escapism. And so I thought, well, this, you know, if I'm writing about everyone else doing that, then I should sort of come clean and acknowledge that I am doing the same. And it's precisely because the house is this great enabler. You know, I think that everyone, that all these characters, so there's Giovanni Rucellai and his immediate family. I sort of go generation by generation. There is his favorite son, Bernardo, who would marry Nannina de' Medici. Bernardo was the black sheep, the father's favorite, but also the black sheep. And he tried his best to run away from that house and to go off and entertain lavishly in the countryside. But then when Giovanni declared bankruptcy, he was forced back into Florence because all the properties had to be sold to hold on to the house. And they're all living under the roof. So there's always been multiple generations in that house, tensions, different politics, and so the house is very much a microcosm where a whole lot is happening at any given time. Then of course there are a lot of weddings, and the great Medici Rucellai wedding, about which we know a lot, but also the suicide bride, the popular story of Bianca, the ghost of Palazzo Rucellai, said to have hurled herself into the courtyard on the eve of her wedding, so not a happy ending. 18th century brides, weddings that inspired great frescoes, ceiling paintings in the house. But also, it wasn't all celebration and merriment. There was also some gruesomeness that happened well before the murder. By the time you read through this book and you reach the story of Alvise de Robilan's murder in the house, it seems like par for the course. I certainly don't mean at all to diminish what happened there in 1997, but it wasn't the first such instance. So we have, for example, a dissection of a monster that took place in the Orti Rucellai, in the Rucellai gardens that are just about half a mile away, maybe, from the palazzo. And that monster, in fact, was conjoined twins that had just been born, had been collected and rushed into the garden. And there was a private dissection of this monster. Bronzino was present and painted a portrait. Unfortunately, that portrait doesn't survive today. It's lost. And it was meticulously recorded. So that's a very disturbing moment in the history of the house of the House of Rucellai. And then even jumping ahead a little bit to the 19th and early 20th century, when for the first time, non-Rucellai are living in the house now, or at least for the first time that it's recorded. And in the early 19th century, Henry Layard moves in with his family. His son, Austin Henry Layard, who would go on to be a great statesman and archaeologist, recounts the wonderful story of living on the Piano Nobile with a monumental leafy altarpiece of an adoration of the child hanging above his bed. And anyone who's been on a Piano Nobile understands the size of these rooms. So you could indeed have a monumental altarpiece above your bed. And he recounts getting in a fight with his brother, and one of them threw a shoe at the other, and it nicked the frame. And then, of course, that altarpiece would leave the family. It was sold to the National Gallery just a little bit later, and Layard recounts visiting it in London, now hanging on the walls of the gallery as an old roommate, now transported to London. So all of a sudden you've got people coming in and objects going out. So a lot of two-way traffic there. And then you also have people marrying into the family, of course. We've always had that. One in particular is a fascinating but toxic character. That's Lizina Rucellai, who was a twice widowed Russian countess who comes in, and she is famous for her parties, her tango teas that she held in the Palazzo with Harold Acton, with D'Annunzio. And we've got wonderful, her memoir, Acton's memoir, and some other archival letters that I was able to pull together. It paints a very vivid picture of a very eccentric character who also was a supporter of Mussolini. And she writes about, she complains, I should say, about not being able to take her Mercedes out of the courtyard for fear that people would throw ink onto the car. Imagine the size of a Mercedes back then, and how in the world she got that in and out of the courtyard of Palazzo Rucellai. But she also talks about people throwing stones onto the facade, that again, complaining they had to turn off the lights, shut the shutters in the front of the house because people were stoning it. So I think, you know, that piece is so suggestive to me because it underscores the relationship, the ever-present relationship of this house to all of these characters. They are never separated from the house, and in this case, she's writing about what it was like to live with Palazzo Rucellai during the war. So and then the last main character that I introduce is Alvise de Robilant, who was living in the house on the third floor when that murder took place. So it is a wide range of characters, each one representative of the time in which they lived, but they also bring a new way of understanding this house, this space, and you know, who they wanted to be was very much enabled by the architecture. So, you know, life is a performance on any given day. And, you know, and so when I moved into the house, all of a sudden, there were so many opportunities for me to perform, especially in Palazzo Rucellai. And so I did take full advantage of that. And again, just sort of followed in the footsteps of all of these ghosts that I was living with in that house.
Hello, Alison. We've lost Helen for a moment,
okay.
So I'm going to play hostess and ask some of the questions from our listeners.
Okay.
We have one question about, did you ever find out about who had lived in the room you rented in the earliest days before you?
No, I didn't. At the time that I was living in the house, there were very few people around. I mean, and I'm sure that's still the case today. Palazzo Rucellai is not an enormous palazzo. It's not Palazzo Pitti. It's not Palazzo Strozzi. It's a more modest space. There was a school in operation, still is today, on the Piano Nobile. But when I was living in the house, the students had to use the rear entrance.
Oh my goodness.
So I didn't see them. I also tried not to see them because they were, you know, ruining my whole escapism plan. So I could easily avoid the students and feel that I had the house entirely to myself. And I do know at the time, the penthouse, Altana, I mean, just the large apartment that runs across the entire top of Palazzo Rucellai, it was an open space, but it was enclosed. and that was rented out at the time. And there were a couple of different tenants during my residency, my extended residency in the house.
Okay.
But the Archivio, no, I don't know who lived there before me. How many people even may have lived there before me. In the beginning of the book, I talk extensively about the apartment and how it had been outfitted. And it was very much a dumping ground for all of the stuff the family didn't want. And so it was, a dumping ground of really great stuff, but things that, again, they had no other place for, so they were moved into my apartment. That mixed with some IKEA furnishings, which really made things very disconcerting for me.
I'll pass you back to Helen. Apologies for the technical interruption, but here is Helen again.
Hi, Helen.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Carry on, Allison. I managed to listen to the last of what you were saying, so please do continue. Yeah.
So let's see, where was I? The room, the space. Right below me was the archive, family archive. I couldn't get in there. It was very private, and for good reason. That's not open to the public, and I'm certainly not to the public, and probably to just very few researchers, if any. So that was almost an identical space in terms of the floor plan. There too, on that floor, a mezzanine floor had been added. And I also had, in addition to that birdcage elevator, there was a sort of secret stair that connected to the main stair. That was.
I remember that part. I love that part in the book. It's like, ooh, edging, and then no.
Yeah. And very. Again, anyone who has walked through one of these palazzi, even just maybe going to your dentist, depending on the light is never reliable. So you have to turn on the light only when you get to a certain landing, and it has a very short life, and it will run out inevitably before you get to the next landing. So it's like hopscotch, sort of up and down these steps in these old palaces. And so I did have that experience. It was either getting stuck in the birdcage elevator or trying my luck with the lighting going up and down the stairs. And then there was also this spiral stair that there's a wonderful picture in the book. It's a vintage Alinari photo. Well,
it just looks terrifying in the book as well.
Terrifying. There's no hand railing. And in the Alinari photo, there isn't even a central rope to have something to hold on to. But that had been installed at some point in the 20th century because that was there for me. But that actually made my steps even more unsteady because as you held on to this, it was like a pendulum. Yeah. It moved. And so that did not instill any sense of safety at all. But, that really also captures the sense that I had every day for that residency in Palazzo Rucellai of not being on steady ground. Because I was living between centuries, really. And that was my intention. But it was fascinating. It was riveting. But it also was dizzying. And, at the end of all of this, I ran away from Palazzo Rucellai. At a certain point, I just had too much, and too much of the old world, too much of the escapism. And I thought, okay, I've got to get out of here. I've got to move back to the new world and actually sit down and write the book. So I was thinking about the book, of course, while I was living in the house. I was doing the research. I was crafting the narrative, going back to the way that I tell the story and the style of the writing that the personal narrative worked in. I had never done that kind of writing before. Obviously, that's not what we do as art historians, but it was it was also clear to me that it was absolutely necessary that I take this on. And, it was a big learning curve, but it was also so liberating as an art historian not to follow the same format and to just, turn Renaissance art history upside down in many ways by doing this. And so, but it wasn't until when I left, I moved to New York, and it wasn't until I was actually in New York, in a very contemporary building now, that I could sort of digest what I had been through, what I had experienced there, and really pull out the story and start to piece it together and then write all of this.
We've got quite a few comments coming in, Alison, from people who know Palazzo Rucellai as well, which is interesting, And Margaret says, I worked in the Palazzo from 2000 to 2002 and can assure you it is haunted. So Margaret's obviously got some experiences there as well. I don't know if it's the same presences that you encountered, but Margaret's encountered that too. And then I don't know whether I was out when I was out there for a second, whether Jay mentioned Sheila, who worked in Palazzo Rucellai for about 6 months in 2009 as an employee, and she loves your book, and it's beautifully written. And I couldn't agree more with Sheila. Hello from Philadelphia. People loving Florence. So, I mean, there's people all over mentioning Paola. And this is something I did want to mention as well. This is one of the things one of those remarkable moments that still stands out for me from your book. When you're there, you've been researching, you've been studying in various archives, and then you just have this moment where you just look at the front, the facade of the palazzo, and you realize there are these odd markings on the wall. Maybe you could explain to us what those, that moment when you saw those markings, and did you get to the bottom of it, Alison?
Okay, yes. So that's, that's a great story, because as fully immersive as I wanted this experience to be, and believe me, it was immersive, there were things that just kept popping up, and that I hadn't noticed before. It's as though the facade, or the house, just even the house, this is a story about the facade, but it was as though the house, like we were playing a game. I really did feel that way. Every time I thought, oh, I'm this much closer to understanding this house, no, it would trick me, and it would introduce something else. It was like it was peeling away. It was like one facade after another. And so there I was, well into the residency, and there was the great little cafe across the street, Amarini. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so I used to take my morning cappuccino there, and just standing up at the bar, sort of, getting ready for the day. And there's a lovely light that fell on the palazzo. And so I'm just walking across the very narrow Via della Vigna Nuova, all of 15 feet at the most. I'm walking across the street back to the house, and just admiring, right, the elegance of the facade, the thing I thought I knew best about the house. And I see then the light sort of captures this incision in the facade, and it's just about 2 or 3 inches, and very subtle. It's not deeply carved in, but it's symbols, some recognizable, like letters, P and X, others were a cross, some symbols just unrecognizable to me. And there was something so modern about that moment. I remember I just went straight to the facade. I was mesmerized. And so I was just staring at it. I was just a few inches away from it. So the peripheral vision was nothing but these blocks, Alberti's blocks. And it looked like a modernist painting to me. And and that too was again disconcerting. But again, it's a house in the 20th century. The house survives all of these lives that I write about. I mean, the protagonist of the story is Palazzo Rucellai, and so it somehow, it's an icon of Western architecture, and yet to me, when I sort of embraced that and sort of accepted it and got out of the romantic mindset and started thinking about the afterlife of the house, the current life of the house, then I sort of appreciated the many ways that I felt that it was keeping up, or making itself relevant. I think in a coy way, because it never made itself entirely modern or relevant. But there was just enough that just kept me getting closer and closer to the house. There's another line in the book, I don't remember where it is, maybe in the very beginning, where I say that my residency was a turning inside out for me as much as the house. Right. And I think that's because we really were playing with each other, and I try to capture that in the language, in the story, with all of these different anecdotes. So the carvings on the facade, so what are they? I think it was Alberti being really clever. He was very clever. So they mimic, I think it's a mimicry of stonemasons' symbols, because typically the stones for a facade, for any large construction, they would be carved off-site or maybe on-site, but they would have to be carved and then reassembled or assembled for the first time on the house. So those markings were clues, really, how to connect these puzzle pieces, right? And we know that happened. But at Palazzo Rucellai, the facade is literally a screen. Those blocks that you see are not blocks at all. It is maybe a 2-inch thick screen. So they're not solid blocks that were stacked up. And in fact, they're not individual super shallow blocks. Alberti actually, I'll use this bookcase behind me actually. So this would look like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 12, right, shelves, 12 units. Instead of, if we think of that, that can stand for the facade, rather than Alberti actually stacking 12 pieces, this was actually one piece for him, one piece of stone, but then he carved it to make it look as though it was 12 separate pieces. There's probably an equivalent to this in like modern methods of installing flooring, for example. Okay. A bigger piece that suggests that it's a mosaic of many different pieces. But so given that, then they weren't practical stonemasons' carvings, but it wouldn't put it past me to imagine Alberti just mimicking that. And, he was also a cryptologist and wrote a book on cryptology that is still used today by the US military. And so I also like to think that there's also a secret message there. I haven't been able to crack that project. I don't know that I have time. I'll give that to someone else. But yeah, there's that's a mysterious element to the facade, and you just have to stare at it to really see it, and then of course you see them everywhere.
I think it's fascinating your relationship with this particular palazzo, and how you've explored it, but you still, despite all of your research and even having lived in the palazzo, there are certain things that just remain elusive. I just find that absolutely engaging. I mean, it's very similar. I'll just throw this out there while people are watching, but I'm very interested to know, amongst readers of the Florentine, your personal relationships to certain places in Florence, maybe Palazzo where you've worked, where you've lived. here at the Florentine, we're based in Via di Banchi, near, Alberti's famous Santa Maria Novella. And we're in Palazzo Mondragone. And it has a history all of its own. And it has those moments of incredible, during the day, it's actually very amicable. The building is very happy to be inhabited by people who are working here. But there is that feeling in the evening that this palazzo likes to be left alone. So I don't know, I just throw that out there to our readers. Excuse me, Alison. I think it's interesting to that relationship between humans and architecture, especially architecture that's been around for centuries. And a question, and as we wrap up, what do you miss most about living in a palazzo? I know you couldn't wait to get away from it in the end. And have you been back since you lived there? Have you been back through the door at all?
Yes, let's see, a couple of years ago, I did go back into the courtyard. And sure, I've also gone back to the school, not to lecture or anything, but just to say hello to the director. So I have been back. I have not been back in Archivio, although I have seen it recently because I did a talk for the British Institute, and a member of the audience is living presently in the top piece, in the penthouse. And
no.
There's a slightly different, I mean, they haven't changed the architectural configuration, but she has access to Archivio because it's right below that penthouse. So it makes sense in terms of the layout. But so maybe she's using it for when friends come to visit. But there she was, and she had her camera on, and she walked us all through down the steps and back into my apartment. And it was, I was speechless. I never expected to see that space again. And it was so moving. It brought back so many memories. It was unbelievable. So yes, that apartment is still there, set up as an apartment. And what do I miss most about it? Just it, I mean, it is such a very special place. I mean, I do feel so still deeply connected to that building. And I feel like together we went through a lot. And I feel like, my relationship with that house is unique. And I know other people will also have their own connection to that house. But I just feel like the time that I was there with it brought us together in ways I never would have imagined, and I think never will disappear. The courtyard, I'd say, is just a very lovely space within the house that I was particularly fond of, especially in the evenings when I came home. So yes, they like to be left alone at night. No question. And if you don't leave them alone, they will act up. So it was usually nighttime elevator problems, and all the noises and the odors that they emit, they really come alive. I think these houses are very nocturnal, and it's best to just go to sleep and wake up fresh. But when I would come home from dinner, I think maybe that's what I miss most, is that ritual walk back to Palazzo Rucellai. Again, I've got to bring it back to the key to the front door. Opening that, I never ever took that gesture for granted. And then instead of going straight up to my apartment, I would go into the courtyard and just be there by myself in this very intimate space, and run my fingers across those columns. And it was a very special ritual that I had. So I'd say I miss that the most.
Alison, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear you speak about this book. It's a pleasure to read it. I would encourage our readers, if you haven't read it already, you've got the website address there. I've got the hardback in red, and you see we've got both of them there. We've got both copies. They're both equally beautiful. Take your choice. If you're here in Florence, obviously there's places like the Paperback Exchange in Via delle Orche, which I'm sure would be they'd be very happy to
Yes.
you know, sell you copies and maybe even explain a little bit more. I know they're enthusiastic readers as well themselves. So Allison, thank you very much for joining us.
You, Helen. Thank you all of the listeners for Zooming and joining us and for asking the great questions. And as soon as it's possible to get back to Florence, you know I will be there. So maybe another event to come.
Well, Florence isn't going anywhere. Palazzo Rucellai is still standing there doing its thing, and can't wait to see you, I suppose, in its own unique way with your unique relationship. So thank you again, Allison. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. We'll see you next week. We've got a few more TF Togethers lined up. You can see what's on there. There's the link at the bottom of the page. Have a wonderful weekend and speak to you all soon. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.